Good afternoon. I'm Jasleen Cooley, and I direct the Critical Race Studies program at UCLA School of Law. And I am pleased to welcome you to our third installment of our CRS 2020 to 2021 book series. Um, this, um, this webinar will this webinar is a discussion with Aya Gruber, the author of The Feminist War on Crime, An Unexpected Role of Women's Liberation in Mass Incarceration, who will be in conversation with CRS core faculty member Jennifer Chacón. Jennifer Chacón is professor of law at UCLA School of Law since 2018, and she was previously Chancellor's Professor of Law and Senior Associate Dean for Administration at UC Irvine School of Law. Professor Chacón's research focuses in the fields of immigration law, constitutional law, and criminal law and procedure. Her research has been funded by grants from the National Science Foundation and the Russell Sage Foundation. She is a co-author of the 2017 casebook, Immigration Law and Social Justice, and of numerous articles, essays, and book chapters on citizenship, immigration, border control, and human trafficking. So it is my pleasure to turn it over to Professor Chacón, and we look forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasleen, and thank you to everybody who's here in spite of your undoubted Zoom fatigue. I really am grateful for the intellectual energy that you're bringing to this conversation. I want to welcome you all. I want to thank Jasleen for her relentless organizing efforts and for just generally making the CRS program run in hard times. So thank you, Jasleen. I also want to say that we're going to be talking a lot of big themes today, We'll be talking about abolition, the carceral state, sexism, gender hierarchy, racism, and power and class. And we're going to do so in a way that is necessarily going to ask that we grapple with topics of sexual violence and gender motivated violence in the context of and as an important constitutive element of these broader themes. So for those who are struggling with the trauma of sexual violence or gender motivated violence, this conversation might prove personally difficult. And I just want to acknowledge that now, and also acknowledge that under the current conditions, the pandemic, quarantine, remote learning, all of these things pile on top of themselves. So I want to just ask people to engage with us as you can where you are, acknowledging the difficulties that the format and the kind of ongoing climate creates. The discussion today is going to be not a formal presentation, but more in the sort of context of a conversation. So I'm going to be talking with Professor Gruber about her book. I want to ask her some questions about it, and then I want to open it up to you to ask some questions as well. And I want to what I'll do is probably at about I think this goes till 1:30. So probably at about 1:10, I'll turn over to the Q&A. You have a Q&A function. I'll monitor that, and I will consolidate questions and allow Professor Gruber to address them. Before we start, I should introduce our distinguished guest. So Aya Gruber is a professor at the University of Colorado School of Law, where she teaches criminal law, criminal procedure, and critical theory. She's a lifelong feminist, a former public defender, a professor of criminal law for 18 years, and a survivor. And so she has both personally and professionally grappled with these issues of feminism's influence on criminal law. She is a graduate of UC Berkeley and has her law degree from Harvard Law School. She, after law school, clerked for U.S. District Court Judge James L. King of Miami. And then she served as a felony trial attorney with a public defender service in Washington, D.C. Before beginning her teaching career. She started at FIU as a founding faculty member, and she, in addition to her current appointment, she's also taught at University of Iowa and at Harvard Law School. So I'm really excited to welcome her here. I'm really excited to be talking about her book, which I can't tell if it's backward or forward for you as you're looking at it, hopefully forward. And I want to give her a chance to tell us about her book. So welcome, Professor Gruber, and thank you for being here with us. I was hoping you might start by giving us your own sort of summary of your book and contextualizing it for us a little bit, telling us a little bit about how you came to think about these themes and how you came to write the book. Uh-oh, you're muted.
Yes, of course. That's how it has to be. It always has to start with, take yourself off mute. So thank you so much, Professor Chacón. I am just delighted and humbled to be a speaker as a part of the Critical Race program at UCLA, which is a storied and formidable program. So thank you all for having me. Thank you, Jasleen, for organizing the whole thing. And Laura Gomez, who's the director of the program. And your faculty members are amazing, and you do amazing work at a really important time to do such work. And I just appreciate being in conversation with you, Professor Chacón, as somebody who endeavors to tell people's stories from the bottom up and really make the law and how it affects people real for your readers and your students. So this is just an absolute humbling delight to be here. So the book, yes, it is something that I think was possibly a lifetime in the making. I remember from really a young age, just being on the maybe anti-incarceration side of things, even as a young kid. My mother had been in the Japanese internment camps during World War II, and I grew up with those stories, right? Like many people who grew up with their stories of their parents being subject to some form of government detention, and one based on race, I had this real skepticism of whether there were ever detention success stories. And so I remember having that, and also at the same time, going through high school and going through college, I was a self-identified feminist. I believed in women's rights. I thought that there, and I still think that there's massive gender subordination in the world. But there was always this message in the ether. In college, I was a philosophy major. I wasn't in women's studies. There were, back then, actually not even that many women's studies programs, which it's great that there are so many more now. So I didn't really have a technical vocabulary for it, but I always just felt this notion in the background that the measure of women's subordination was private gender violence, right? Gender violence committed by individual men against women, rape and domestic violence, and that the remedy to this gender violence, which was the marker of women's subordination, was criminal law, was more prosecution. So I had these really two competing sentiments when I went to law school, which I kind of call a feminist defense attorney dilemma, which doesn't really capture all the avenues of that dilemma. But I mean, I really felt it so much so that right before I became a public defender, I remember being really torn and worrying more about representing a man charged with misdemeanor domestic violence than representing somebody charged with murder. That is how strong I felt this connection between private violence, women's subordination, and prosecution. It was so strong that even I, sort of a dyed-in-the-wool public defender person who had interned at the Miami-Dade County Public Defender since I was 14 years old, really didn't see how I could, defend those people. And so that was the origin. And then I actually became a public defender in Washington, D.C., and I practiced in a specialized domestic violence court that feminism built. I mean, this was a legacy of a lot of, really painstaking and thoughtful feminist advocacy. But it ended up in a system that was more of the same and even more pronounced. Misdemeanor processing of mostly poor men of color and many women of color, a revolving door of incarceration. I saw prosecutors going forward with cases against women's wishes. Some even used material witness warrants to force women to testify. I saw women themselves who would be a victim in a domestic violence case on one day, and the next day have their own drug, neglect, abuse, and even domestic violence cases stemming from the police call that was supposed to help them. I saw, and this was actually quite frequent, immigrant women call the police for help without realizing that they were triggering this penal machine that pretty much was a conveyor belt to leading their partner and sometimes themselves to be deported. So I saw all these things, and I understood very well from my own feelings why feminists had believed that prosecution would produce gender justice. But the model was just so much more complicated, that when I became a professor, I started writing just about these different law reforms substantively. But in this book, I really tried to go back to my torn feelings and examine why it was that I felt for so long that prosecution was a measure of gender justice, when I knew that the system of mass incarceration really was mired in so many problems of racial hierarchy and class and economic disempowerment. Like, why was that feminist instinct so strong? And so that's really the origins of the book. Mute.
My turn. So thank you for that. I wanted to actually, before we went any further, maybe ask you a little bit about language, because you talk about this in the introduction of the book, and I think it's really helpful to sort of framing the conversation. You talk about the way that often, particularly when we're thinking about conversations around criminal law in the domestic violence spaces, sexual assault, it is framed as a man-woman binary, with the man frequently, pretty much always sort of positioned as perpetrator, woman as the individual who's experienced the violence. And I think you in the book, and there are there's lots of binary language and lots of binary choices about language that are frequently made in these spaces. And you in the book sort of point that out, and you deliberately sort of use some of these binary frames in part as a sort of a deliberate invocation of them, because it's sort of deconstructive to bring them into the space and to sort of demonstrate how they operate, how they operate as tropes, and how they do work. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that and talk a little bit about how you choose your linguistic framing when you're having a conversation about your book and the topics in it.
Yeah, I thought about gender neutral pronouns, which I try to use when things are general, right? So maybe on an exam and things like that, you could use they. I found it very difficult to do so in writing about feminist interventions into criminal law, because they have been so gendered and they had so many assumptions about the relationship of these constructed genders, right? Like what what people throughout decades and centuries have thought of as woman, and what people have thought of as man, and how these constructed genders have different relationships to sex, violence, the state. And even, modern day feminists, they are saying there is something called woman, right? That is suffering subordination. So we can't be completely deconstructive of gender identity, because then that kind of undermines the political coalition. So I found it very difficult, but at the same time, it was so clear to me how the language of a lot of these gender crimes, of rape, of sex work, of domestic violence, just shored up the notion of gender, and continues to shore up the notion of gender in an era where I think people are questioning gender as a construct more than ever. So I thought that was very interesting. And I also think that there was a part of feminism that deliberately, and it wasn't all feminism, it's kind of what I identify in the second wave feminism as sort of anti-patriarchy feminists. So feminists for whom it was really important for people to understand a lot of the ills in society as a function of this thing called patriarchy, which was kind of a silent structural system that operated to keep women subordinate and men dominant. And, you know, the anti-patriarchy feminists were very concerned in establishing these private violences, these men against women violences, you know, which are always less private than we think, right? They always operate within structures and within hierarchies that perpetuate violence. But you know, what we've identified as private versus state violence against women, it was very important for them to tie it particularly to this patriarchal structure. So that meant that domestic violence was in fact a matter of what sexist men within patriarchal marriages were permitted and encouraged to do to women. Because part of focusing on this framing of domestic violence also helped feminists argue against marriage norms and different kind of sexist norms that they were upending. But at the same time, you see a really stark clash between anti-patriarchy feminists and feminists of color in these 1978 civil rights hearings over, you know, what they called wife abuse back then. And a Latina shelter feminist, Shelly Fernandez, from an organization that still exists, La Casa de las Madres, which is out of San Francisco, came up and basically said the soil and root of all violences, including domestic violence, is white supremacy. The way it structures men's experiences, the way it structures women's experiences, the way the state categorizes violences and treats them, right? And so then she went on to talk about these kind of like socioeconomic and racial issues. And then a very prominent feminist judge came up to speak to the issue. And she was actually not even assigned to respond to the Latina feminist argument. But she said, you know, I really just have to say that this is not a problem of white society. This is a problem of every woman, right? This is not socioeconomics. It is the marriage structure that we've all lived with. And to the extent that Chicanos, and this is her words, Chicanos and Blacks have more domestic violence, they should interrogate their culture, right? So there was this sense of kind of the anti-patriarchy feminists just kind of saying like, hey, you know, feminists of color, don't use men's race as an excuse for their sexism. If anything, recognize that your culture is sexist. So there was this kind of a clash, and it was you know, an unfortunate clash. It was actually an unfortunate clash because it put two potentially synergistic parties at war with each other. And I think that the every woman patriarchy at the expense of intersectionality and looking at race really won the day in that argument.
I thought your account of that 1978 Commission on Civil Rights hearing was fascinating. It's just an amazing story, and just seeing also the sort of the fallout for the judge who spoke and sort of the way her, you know, her own story, right? Right. I think highlights the extent to which you know, this lost opportunity winds up having these personal reverberations. I think you've already started to touch on this, but I wonder if you want to say a little bit more. The book really sort of takes us through a whole bunch of different feminisms. And in fact, at one point in the introduction, you say the feminist war on crime is a feminist civil war. So you sort of, I think throughout the book, you have a very rich account of feminism, sort of speaking to a plurality of feminisms and also phases and waves of feminism in history. And I wanted to know if you wanted to unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I think feminism has never been a monolith from the beginning, right? And so we identify feminism, and feminist legal theorists have probably done a much better job than I've been tracking all the different types of feminisms and kind of identifying what the core commitment is. And, you know, a lot of people have said it's just a core commitment to substantive and procedural justice, egalitarianism, and the idea that, you know, anti-subordination, that everybody should have the ability to live a good life, which kind of collapses feminism, the large tent category feminism to every other social justice movement, left movement. But it's really interesting because people still treat feminism as if it's one thing when it's this rich history of internal contestation, right? Like external strategic alliances, making choices about short-term gains versus long-term, structures. I just think that, I think of something Angela Harris said about strategies becoming institutions. Well, everybody does that, right? And feminists were no different. But I'll give you an example of a clash of feminism. Right before the turn of the century, in the 1890s, there was one of, and people don't know about this much, the most successful rape reform movements of all times, even, possibly more successful than Me Too or second wave date rape reform. And that was the effort to raise the age of consent to sex. And this effort, the age of consent was low. It was 10. That was an Old English common law rule. And there were, gross cases of abuse. And so feminist temperance advocates who were, against vice and sex, but also feminist, right? They were for protecting women and for empowering women, and many of them were suffragists. They pushed to raise the age of consent to, 16, 17, 18. And one of the reasons they did so was because of these harmful cases of rape, but also because cases of underage sex led to women's ruination because they then couldn't get married, which led them into the sex work industry, which led to vice and licentiousness. So there was kind of this dual moralism feminism. Well, there was and in fact, they were wildly successful. By the early 1900s, every state had raised the age of consent, and they were like sort of fiery talks about rape and debauchery and everything else. And so that was a good part, that a lot of rapes were prevented, but also there were jail-like reformatories filled with girls, with unruly girls who'd run afoul of the rule not to have underage sex. But here's the clash that I kind of highlight in the book. Frances Willard, who was the president of this temperance union, would go down to the South and do these tours in favor of the age of consent reforms. And she would use fiery rhetoric about the ills of rape. Well, that ran smack dab into the epidemic lynching premised on Black men's inherent, sexual deviance and also magnetism and, fecundity and all this stuff. And she was roundly criticized by another feminist, but an anti-lynching feminist, Ida Wells. And so Ida Wells accused Frances Willard of stirring up lynch mob sentiments in support of her age of consent reforms. And Willard shot back that because Ida Wells was calling white women liars, she was anti-woman. And so you see, tensions and debates that repeat themselves throughout time within different feminist camps. And I think it's very important for young feminists today who are struggling with some of these issues of being zero tolerance, when it comes to Me Too and sexual assault, and also really in a post-Floyd Black Lives Matter moment, questioning the racialized mass incarceration and really looking at criminal law as an institution to understand that these clashes have been going on for a long time and kind of the history of them and the outcomes of them.
Thanks. You've sort of led right up to the obvious next question, which is your book is sort of coming out into a moment where some of these themes have been resurrected, some of the same debates are playing out, and specifically sort of you're doing a book tour sort of on the heels of Me Too, and your book actually sort of takes us through a little bit, references Harvey Weinstein, takes us through the story of Aziz Ansari, takes us through the story of Brock Turner. So some of the stories that have really been in the headlines as part of the broader social conversation. And so I wanted you to say a little bit about sort of what it's been like to work through the book in this time, and also to talk about the book in this time, and sort of what you're adding to the conversation and what you're learning from the conversation.
That's really great, because I think, the conversation is ever evolving and there's so much to learn. And, another thing that having a book out and doing, I guess, a Zoom, a Zoom tour, I had never been on Twitter before I published the book. So in sort of responding to the publisher saying, authors, you really need to get on Twitter, I got on Twitter, and it has been so informative it's really been, for as much as I have critiques like everybody else about Twitter culture and the role of Twitter in the Trump era and everything else, it's been really informative for me to kind of understand some of the contemporary debates out there as they happen, instead of reading them, about them in the newspaper and synthesizing them over months and months and months. When I started writing this book, and it was a multi-year process, and the book changed throughout it, I had to go back and rewrite the introduction, because when I started it, Me Too hadn't occurred yet. And like all those evolutions really informed the book. Now in the lexicon, the term carceral feminism, which was coined by Elizabeth Bernstein, a sociologist out of Columbia, has become, a term that's more known, as has, a term like neoliberalism. And those things were a little less known even just a few years before, and they've become part of the vocabulary in a way that's made it easier to talk about these issues. So I don't know, it really struck me, this puzzle, right? This tension where some of the most vehement and vocal prison critics were also extremely punitive when it came to gender defenses, and even really what we criminal law people like defense attorneys would consider low-level offenses, commentary and sexual contact. And, the fact that in a moment where people are on the right and left, the Koch brothers and Obama, like coming together on the Sentencing Reform Act, when people are talking about sentencing and bail reform, the what about rapists issue would come up frequently, but not on the right wing, like sort of what about child predators, right? That was familiar from the 80s and 90s, but in modern terms, like what about, women subordinating rapists? So I just found that tension was really interesting, that, feminism became this legitimator of penalty in an era of, a declining faith in the operation of criminal law, and that rape and domestic violence were getting this carve out or even a veto over these criminal law reforms. And I just really wanted to understand why, and also was wondering if it was because a lot of what I call millennial feminists in the book, millennial Gen Z feminists who basically grew up in an era that was both informed by the new Jim Crow and understandings of the institutionally racist nature of the American penal state, and by the sort of Title IX campus rape crisis and the new understandings of sexual violence. So I thought, maybe a lot of these millennial feminists are feeling the same way I did, when I just believed it was in the ether, this very dominance, what I now know is a dominance feminist notion that sex and gender violence ostensibly committed privately is the marker of women's subordination. And then, that focus crowds out everything. Like, for example, the fact that one of the most, if not the most concentrated sites of sexual violence are jails, right? And against women and men. So I was just thinking that maybe in this Me Too era, where the focus is so much on broadening things that count as sex crimes and gender crimes, if I shouldn't sort of speak to this group as I'm speaking to my law school self, saying, we can interrogate some of these ideas about the necessity of embracing prosecution as the salvation for women. you did ask something else. You asked like, how was the reception? Right, sorry about that.
Yeah. No, that's,
I was expecting this. So here's what's interesting. The book was slated to come out in 2019, which would have put its release right around the Harvey Weinstein trial and that 23-year sentence and verdict, which was, widely lauded as the main victory of Me Too, which I didn't feel about Me Too that way. I felt it had so many other like non-carceral victories and symbolic victories, but, and so then I thought, given that this book is going to come out, basically questioning the feminist connection to the carceral state in an era where feminists are really celebrating like this particular moment of incarceration, I was expecting a lot of pushback, a lot of sort of the contemporary, are you a men's rights person, or do you not take sexual violence seriously? And, I have answers to all of that, but I was just expecting really a lot of readings of the book that were not as true to what the book meant to be as I would have hoped. But COVID happened and the publisher pushed the release of the book back to the summer of 2020. And so the book ended up being released in the midst of the worldwide 25 million person strong uprising in the face of the egregious racial violence committed by the state against George Floyd and other citizens. And people were reading the book differently. And it was just very interesting. They were reading it as more how I intended it, as not letting sort of feminism be co-opted and incorporated into the carceral state, but also in a very, very interesting way as an indictment of quote unquote white feminism. And so like a lot of people had seen the Amy Cooper video and the Living While Black moments and thought that this is a clash of a white female identity group and they're claiming the mantle of an oppressed group to really use state powers against another oppressed group, which was an interesting take on it. And I think that's definitely part of the story. I mean, throughout all of these stories, we see the voices of women of color being marginalized. That being said, a lot of these carceral reforms were also pushed by women of color and, interestingly, most often pushed by white women in the name of women of color who needed the protection the most. So there is a very, very complex racial politic going on there. But I had more, hoped it would be in the vein of speaking to self-identified feminists about the carceral state, but it got caught up in it. So it got a much better, what I'm trying to say is it got a more sympathetic reception than I think it would have a year before.
That's really interesting. And just thinking of those two moments and the way that in some ways that's the sort of perfect illustration of what you're taking us through in the book, the sort of the way those moments are really constantly operating together under the surface, though not always publicly prominent. I think what I want to do is I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'd like to offer you a chance to read a little bit from your book so the people who are here can hear your voice. And then while you're reading, if people have questions, they can put them up in the Q&A and I can moderate those questions for you. So, but before I sort of turn it over to you to read, I wanted to think a little bit more about sort of where the prescriptions of the book and sort of what you see as the plan. And I think in the concluding chapter, you do a really nice job of sort of pointing at directions. And obviously, I think you take very seriously the need for people to be able to move through the world safely, right? Having a sense that social institutions are there to protect you. And, that's such a powerful kind of fundamental part of being free. And it seems like it should be the goal for everybody. And it's something that's often denied women, it's often denied queer people, it's often denied gender non-conforming people, it's often denied people of color. And I think your book sort of grapples with the complexity of that. So I wanted to give you a chance to sort of reflect on how you see us recreating a movement and a world that puts notions of safety on equal footing for everybody, right? Everybody's safety, everybody's security. How do you imagine non-carceral alternatives that generate these systems of safety? Who do you look to? Who are the people doing work in the world who have vision around this that you find inspiring? What do we do? It's my simple question to you before I let you read.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a fascinating question that I've been thinking about a lot. I think there's a lot to unpack there, because I don't pretend to solve the problem of gender-based violence or subordination upon many axes. I do seek to weigh in on whether the just future, the liberationist future, is achieved by incarceration one man at a time, right? And I just think we have a wealth of experience with our particular, and it's very American. It has very American histories in both enslavement and the control of workers during industrialization, gender, and everything else. We have a very specific American history of the carceral state and how it has operated in, earlier times and since the tough on crime era of the 80s. And so I think that my main contribution would be to say, I don't believe we should carve out gender crimes, or, I concentrate on gender and feminism and violence against women. And the analysis might be different in other areas, but I'm always very wary when we carve out of the critique of this carceral institution crimes that seem to be addressed to punishing our preferred bad people, whether they are Trump, or racists or anybody else, for two reasons. One, it assumes a certain logic of the criminal justice system as protection and liberation. And not only is it not that in practical operation, like we could be legal realists and say, well, it doesn't operate that. I would go beyond that. I would say it was never that. It was always a fantasy that police would come and save you. Now, police have come and saved some people, but that is the exception rather than the rule, which is that police are a management tool of the state that has a huge, I wouldn't say monopoly, but a huge amount of control over the means of death and violence. And I just don't think that investing more in that system is really the path forward to protect people from violations, to make sure people are equal and live a good life. That's one of the things I would say, is that, feminists can be critical of the reality of American incarceration, but rather than sort of buying into, I think, a very publicized and pushed on everybody fantasy about how policing and prosecution work. And the second thing that I'll say is, there's something to be said about this time where defunding the police is on the table, prison abolition is on the table, and all these ideas of how to, like in your scholarship, within communities from the bottom up, think differently about safety and community services. We have a really interesting time. And this book was written before the defund, but I write this anecdote about a Megyn Kelly show where they have an activist, Jessica Disu, and they're talking about sort of community policing and depolicing. And it was mostly in the wake of Ferguson, right? This was kind of what blew it up. And Disu said, we want to demilitarize the police, disarm the police, defund the police. I mean, this was so, prescient. It was like 3 years ago. And there was a smattering of laughter in the audience. And, Megyn Kelly kind of looks at her with this, utter look of disdain. And she said, well, if we don't have police, who are going to protect the people? Who's going to protect us? And it was meant to be a rhetorical question. And that went viral. And Disu got death threats and really was really quite tortured over this quote that was just thought of as wild 3 years ago. And in reality, she could have answered, I will, because already her organization was going out there and having mothers in their neighborhoods do mother patrols that were being very effective. So it just, those kind of things, those kind of thinking of new ideas and giving up on, putting our eggs in the criminal law basket, which, the criminal law, I say it has been, the criminal system has been amazingly successful in so many ways. It's kind of like Foucault said, after forever wondering whether it really reduces crime, whether it really helps anybody, we should stop asking, whether the criminal law is malfunctioning. It's functioning as intended, right? And so, I say that one of the biggest successes of criminal law theorizing and operation in politics is the colonization of our minds, just making it so hard for us to think otherwise, but we must think otherwise.
Thank you for that. We've already got a couple of great questions in the queue,
Okay.
and I encourage. No, I'm going to have you read. You are going to. I'm going to encourage people who have questions to go ahead and keep using the question function, and I will try to do some rounding up while Professor Gruber reads a little excerpt from her book.
So I am going to read a little part that I think draws a connection between some of the sentiments about sex work, and particularly Asian women engaged in sex work, and between the 1880s, 1890s, and today, and well, really, and the 2010s. Okay, so the primary racial imagery of sexual slavery involved white girls entrapped by or sold to foreign men, low-class criminals, or ethnic minorities. Within this narrative, as was often the case with Temperance narrative, the darker a woman's color, the greater her invisibility. By calling white slavery worse than, quote, Negro servitude because of its sexual nature, activists collapse the sexual violence exacted on enslaved Black women and men into less invasive labor harm, and simultaneously presented white prostitutes, often non-physical, financial, and emotional constraints as more dire than the physical torture inflicted on enslaved Black people. Temperance activists lamented that lower class prostitutes, although victims, were also perpetrators of harm. They tempted husbands into debauchery and brought lust and disease into the marital home. Such debauched women needed to be reformed, redeemed, and morally hygienized. This divide between prostitutes and their rescuers had a particularly eugenicist bent on the US West Coast. In the late 1800s, a yellow peril was in full swing. Asians' perverse sexuality figured prominently in anti-immigrant rhetoric. Such sentiments were not confined to the West and are reflected in the New York Daily Tribune's infamous 1854 statement, quote, "The Chinese are uncivilized, unclean, and filthy beyond all conception, without any of the higher domestic or social relations, lustful and sensual in their dispositions. Every female is a prostitute of the basest order." California state legislators pressed the yellow slavery narrative to secure strict immigration laws. One state newspaper remarked, quote, "Chinese females who immigrate into the state are, almost without exception, of the vilest and most degraded class of abandoned women. These women exist here in a state of servitude, besides which African slavery was a beneficent captivity." The moral repulsion for slavery met with hygiene-based fears of exotic venereal diseases. In 1876, Dr. Hugh Tolan, founder of the University of California Medical College, testified to San Francisco lawmakers that Chinese prostitutes were the cause of 9/10 of the syphilis cases in the city, and that his white patients, quote, think diseases contracted from China women are harder to cure. Indeed, the American Medical Association undertook a study on whether Chinese prostitutes were poisoning the nation's blood. Another drawback of Chinese prostitution, one pamphlet warned, was that, quote, commingling with Eastern Asiatics created degenerate hybrid. In 1874, I'm skipping forward a little, California amended its law to give immigration officials power to exclude, quote, a lewd or debauched woman. When the steamer Japan pulled into port in San Francisco in August 1874, the Immigration Commission detained the 22 Chinese women without children on board, designating them debauched. The detainees challenged their custody in the California Supreme Court, which upheld that regulation as valid state authority. The hearings were covered by local newspapers, which faulted the women not for their excessive passivity in the face of their slavery, but for their, quote, noisy demonstrations and saucy backtalk. The Alta California reported that, quote, the whole lot were jabbering and screaming at the top of their voices. It was found impossible to quiet them. There was an awful screech, after which others bellowed at the top of their lungs, forcing the judge to stuff his fingers into his ears and retire to his chambers. So California passed that act. And eventually the question of that act's constitutionality went up to the Supreme Court when they found in that case that the federal government had authority over immigration. And this led to the 1875, Congress passing the 1875 Page Act, which forbade, quote, the importation into the United States of women for the purpose of prostitution. The Page Act was the first federal law to control immigration. And in pressing for the act, its sponsor, Horace Page, emphasized that China was not sending its best people. America was China's, quote, cesspool, he lamented, because, quote, she insists on sending here none but the lowest and most depraved of her subjects. The Page Act paved the way for the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and following the Page Act were also various initiatives to control or prohibit prostitution at the southern and northern US borders and in colonial areas abroad. The Page Act necessitated new systems of monitoring and investigating immigrants and a centralized enforcement system. And a historian notes that enforcement strategies, which were pioneered on Chinese women, because of fears of their sexuality, gradually became extended to every immigrant who sought to enter America. I have a little story, I know that was long, that is kind of like the postscript to that, which if I can indulge you for one more minute, and I know you have to go. In early 2019, the press was all a Twitter with the revelation that the police in Jupiter, Florida had caught Robert Kraft, the billionaire owner of the New England Patriots, receiving sexual services from two women at the Orchids of Asia day spa. The case cast a spotlight on the type of human trafficking interdiction that has become popular among prosecutors, many of whom claim to be progressive prosecutors, and police departments. In October 2018, Jupiter Police Detective Andrew Sharp became suspicious of orchids after going on www.rubmaps.com. He confirmed his suspicions by observing that only men went into the day spa. Sharp directed a health inspector to search the spa under the pretense of checking to see if the female owner operators or employees were illegally residing there. The inspector interviewed the women and took pictures of a refrigerator where they kept snacks. Although the inspection report did not find unlawful habitation in the spa, Sharp regarded the fridge as smoking gun evidence that prostitutes were enslaved and forced to live inside a brothel. He directed officers to follow men leaving the spa, wait for the men to commit any minor traffic infraction, and pull them over and question them about orchids. And apparently several men admitted to sexual activity. In January 2019, citing evidence of trafficking, the police obtained a sneak and peek warrant for the spa, after which they faked a bomb scare so they could evacuate the spa and install video cameras inside. For 5 days, officers monitored and recorded activities in the spa in real time. The police arrested and charged 25 men with misdemeanor solicitation. Also arrested and charged were women who worked at the spa. The owner, 58-year-old grandmother Hua Zhang, the 39-year-old manager Li Wang, 43-year-old Li Chen, and 58-year-old Shen Mingbi, who gave Kraft the hand job and whose face is now splashed across the internet. Announcing the charges in a televised press conference, State Attorney Dave Ehrenberg began with the observation that human trafficking was, quote, modern day slavery, an evil in our midst. Ehrenberg counseled that, quote, the cold reality is that many prostitutes in cases like this have been lured into this country with promises of a better life. Ehrenberg reassured his audience that arrested women could be eligible for expungement of charges if they spoke up to him about trafficking. However, when Ehrenberg and other prosecutors were pressed by the media, they had to admit that, quote, there is no human trafficking that arises out of this investigation. The state promptly offered plea deals involving community service and fines to the men because they were secretly and likely unconstitutionally surveilled. The Asian female Orchid employees, by contrast, were hit with an array of felony and misdemeanor charges related to prosecution and profiteering, and faced a maximum of 15 years for the felonies and up to a year for each of the misdemeanors. Zhang and Wang were charged with 26. Unable to post bail immediately, Wang, the former manager, spent 6 weeks in jail, where inmates asked if it was really her on TV. All the women had various bank accounts and assets frozen for forfeiture. Zhang's lawyer, Tama Kootman, attributed the fact that her client was facing decades in prison to racial stereotypes of helpless trafficked Asian women, adding that Orchid's employees, in fact, were in their 30s and 40s and held multiple massage licenses. To be sure, the discourse justifying modern-day brothel rescue raids is disturbingly reminiscent of yellow slavery panic. Trafficking experts Grace Chang and Kathleen Kim write that symbolically, trafficking has regressed to stereotyped images of poor, uneducated, and helpless young women and girls forced into prostitution, reminiscent of historical concepts of sexual slavery. When Detective Sharp's colleague, Michael Fenton, applied for a warrant to search another Florida massage parlor, Bridgefoot and Massage and Spa, he stated in his application that the spa used, quote, a standard Asian model, meaning, quote, a place to operate prostitution under the guise of massage.
Thank you for that. That's actually a great jumping off point for one of our questions. So I'll put that one first because it ties in nicely. So this person notes that one repeated theme in the book and the conversation is the tension between approaches to gender-based violence on the one hand and other criminalized behavior on the other, right? That something is more extraordinary. I'm curious about another comparison they write, which is between notions of choice and coercion as they operate with respect to gender-based violence and in other domains, including embodied labor. And I think a lot of what you just said sort of ties nicely into this. So they write, issues around commercial sex and trafficking are one obvious meeting place. The notions of consent and coercion deployed against gender-based violence would have very radical anti-capitalist implications if generalized, but that seems not to be the pattern. If anything, there was a striking embrace of capitalist workplace authority by one writer that you mentioned earlier in the book. So do you have thoughts about that comparison and how it has or hasn't played out?
Right, so I think there's so many connections between what feminism became in moving towards the carceral model and what it could have been in terms of labor regulations, understandings of distributional justice. And, it's so striking to me that the original battered women's movement in the early 70s was deeply anti-state, deeply authoritarian, and deeply anti-poverty. It was born out of these sort of Vietnam War era conceptions of the state as, a policing regime, and the problems with a really punitive welfare system. So one very prominent Black feminist of the time, Johnny Tillman, was the president of the National Welfare Rights Organization, right? And she was sort of getting in crosshairs with liberal feminists who were all about kind of the right to work, right? And domestic violence reformers found themselves in this system where the anti-patriarchy feminists were really less worried about this notion that a lot of what is keeping women in these relationships is not just their own economic marginalization, but the marginalization of men, and also racialized marginalization, and the cruel welfare system, which said, hey, if you're a single mother, especially a single Black mother, we will literally send investigators out to check your closets to make sure there are no men around who could pay for you. We'll be that punitive to you. We will require that you not have sex, maybe even undergo some management of your reproductive system. And here's the alternative, or you can have a man and possibly an abuser, right? But it's just interesting that there was a conflict there, right? Instead of a synergy there. And the same can be said of trafficking and labor and sex work, right? Because the focus becomes the sex and its inherent subordination to women, right? That very dominance feminist point of view. And then the solution becomes these very punitive measures against individual people who often these days are the woman who's putting up the woman engaged in the work, or the underage person who has been trafficked into sex, who herself was a former sex worker, right? These individual, very marginalized people, instead of these capitalist networks that are trafficking in all kinds of labor, or not even, global networks, just right here in the United States, the unfair labor, less than $15 minimum wage, $15 minimum wage is hard to get. That's how crazy our, love of late stage capitalism is. So that is to say that all the talk of crime divorced from these larger structures, led to this criminal law, which since the Reagan era has been highly neoliberal. It's been the reason to say that, oh, we don't need welfare policies and reform because, this is people's own fault, right? These are lazy criminal people. And, what the government should be doing is just more protecting you from these individual people who are the real wrongdoers, and kind of not doing anything larger and structural. So I think it's all a piece, right? I think that colonization of the mind, of the government, of the structures by criminal law, which may have co-opted, but also in a way was fed by some of these feminist logics, did really shape the state we are in. And I would say the inhumane and unacceptable state we are in with income inequality.
Thank you. I wanted to give you a chance, and one of our questioners has done that, to talk about campus sexual assault policies. So there's a lot about this in the book, and this questioner wanted to basically sort of note. She notes that she graduated at the height of campus sexual assault crisis in 2014 and read the new Jim Crow right after, and was so taken aback by the focus of sexual violence on elite campuses in elite populations, and was wondering if there are policy proposals that you've seen dealing with campus assault that aren't so blind to racial dynamics, that aren't so criminalizing of people of color on campus.
Yeah, it's an amazing question, because I think, like anything, and especially when it comes to crimes against women, and this is not necessarily gender crime, but just, kind of crimes against white women, the 48 hours and the fascination with it, it has a real class and race component. And I think that inevitably influences, what society writ large thinks about violence against women, and maybe why these, spectacular violence cases against ideal female victims, have been more successful than the labor and everything else, because they buy into a lot of existing hierarchical tropes, including about race and class and, who counts as a woman even, right? Like who counts as a woman in this space? You know, on a new article I'm working on the history of sex and criminal law, you know, there's a really fascinating moment where public sex crime laws on the street were used as a tool to get newly emancipated women, Black women in the South, to have to go back to work in these enslavement-like conditions, because if they were ever unemployed, they called them sexually unruly. And then once they got back into those work conditions, they characterized Black women as having inverted sexuality, which was a huge thing sort of after the turn of the century, this like inverted sexuality and deviance. And so they could be treated like men in field work. So anyway, there's a whole fascinating thing to be said about how the idea of woman in a lot of this discourse is constructed. And I think that definitely was going on in a lot of the campus activism. You know, some feminists of color pushed back saying, we can't do the slut walk. We cannot participate in a label that for us, just as Black women, means something and has such a very different history and is not necessarily empowering in that way. That being said, I think a lot of the Title IX activists, in a way, imagine that this can be a laboratory, that Title IX can be a laboratory where you can experiment with alternatives to criminal modes of addressing sexual assault and sexual behavior, and that it can actually be an alternative to the criminal system. I have my own reservations about whether that's true. In fact, I think it's not. And I think some of the rhetoric, the dialed up rhetoric on these kinds of crimes and rapists running rampant and predators and hunting grounds and stuff has a very carceral bent and does bleed into the criminalization space. And I kind of tell that story with a lot of the activism in Brock Turner, kind of the upshot of it. A lot of good came out of that in terms of awareness, but the legal concrete upshot of it was new mandatory minimum sentences and a defense-friendly judge who, you know, can't get any kind of job now. So I'm not sure that this is going to be a decarceral, restorative, intersectional experiment in the way a lot of Title IX people think it is, but that doesn't mean it can't become that. And I think it can.
I have a couple of questions about teaching around these issues. So one person frames it as a feminist scholar and educator, how do we work through the tensions of lived experiences while still advocating for something beyond carceral justice? So there's resistance sometimes to thinking in kind of alternatives to carcerality in this space. And in a similar vein, one person notes that teaching in criminal law classes, right, also raises similar challenges, especially given the demographics of the classroom, where you often have large numbers of women, but you have relatively small numbers of women of color and men of color. So just thinking through sort of how you teach and sort of what challenges you confront. And I'll just add to that, sort of, we do so much value signaling through the criminal law, right? That's in the US, that's really the only way, right? We know that we know how to tell people we value them, that's to, you know, criminalize their harms, right? And so I think when you're sort of in that space, in that very specific cultural space that you've already referenced, to talk about alternatives to incarceration, to sort of think about alternative modes for safety often feels like a devaluation of a harm, right? And so I wonder how you sort of structure conversations to highlight that, how you suggest working beyond that.
It's a really tough set of issues, and again, the landscape is changing so rapidly. I mean, I feel like we all, you know, have whiplash from Me Too being the national reckoning to sort of the Black Lives Matter protests and George Floyd being the national reckoning. We have whiplash from COVID, we have whiplash from Trump, and all of this makes it, you know, very interesting to teach these issues, but very hard to figure out what is the best, most sensitive, most enlightening, fairest, pedagogically correct way to communicate these ideas. And I think we are in a moment where there is this real notion of personal epistemic privilege. which I also think, we can think about, like, whose lived experience counts most, when, how does that distribute? It doesn't mean we shouldn't, give epistemic privileges to people, but it's another thing to put in the pot of that's already a rich brew of so many things. One thing I'm pretty sure of is that we should teach these tough issues, and we should create the conditions, even though sometimes they run against notions of, speech as violence and speech that can do real harm. I do tend towards the academic freedom in these spaces, because I just think that in the end of the day, as free as tenure professors are, because they're one of the few people who aren't constantly in economic and workplace precarity, people still feel nervous about their livelihoods and their lives. And so I know a lot of people who, I write on this a lot, so I'm kind of a known entity in this space, and I've definitely gotten my fair share of complaints and pushback. But, I know a lot of people who aren't really immersed in this world, who are completely terrified of wading into these waters because they are so murky and there are so many dangers, it seems to them. But I think as responsible teachers, I think it's important to teach, especially about sexual assault, which is an issue that really deeply affects people and their understandings of other people, the law, and state power. So I try to teach it like everything else. I'm starting to reconceptualize. I read this recent article by Alice Ristroff, The Curriculum of the Carceral State, which has, made me think a lot about teaching a lot of things and how we teach them and whether we are reinforcing some of the notions we're against. Like, for example, expressivism, this idea that criminal law is the way you express values. Well, why is that? Why is like putting a body in a cage the way you express a value? It seems to express the number one value, that we can put bodies in cages. So it's something I like to think about. And I don't want anybody's experience of victimization of trauma not to be real. And I wouldn't want to cause real pain in anybody's lives. But I also think that the victimization-based way of approaching criminal law has really been problematic in this country and has led to a lot of things. So it's just a thicket. We need to be careful. And I think the best we can do is try as educators to listen to our students and understand their point of view, express other points of view that are out there in the world, debate them, teach the doctrine, but also be responsible in letting them know that this doctrine doesn't come out of thin air. These ideas don't come out. They all have these rich and oftentimes problematic histories. But definitely what we shouldn't be worried about, I think, is getting fired or getting, something like that. So I would say that we should teach it with open-mindedness and thoughtfulness, but we should teach it. I feel like we should teach it.
Thank you. We have a couple of minutes left. I have many more questions in the queue, so I'm not going to do the queue any favors, but I will ask one more question that's here. So this sort of goes to solutions. There are questions on coalition building, and I think we've already touched on that, but I wanted to sort of kind of highlight when we think about what non-carceral alternatives look like, some of this is about creating social and economic security for people who lack it and who are therefore in vulnerable situations. And one of the questioners sort of highlights the ways that wealthier women who don't need those sorts of, who may be more protected, in terms of their economic status, et cetera, might not see the urgent need for those kinds of interventions. So this questioner asks, can you talk about how, in the quest for alternatives, anti-carceral advocates might contend with wealthier and more privileged survivors' appetite to do something or achieve justice? How do we respond to that instinct? How do we sort of fuel a conversation that goes beyond that instinct?
Right. I think there's been a lot of top-downness in the crafting of solutions, for women. I mean, in some ways, and in some ways they were very much focused, like, for example, in domestic violence, on what actually works for wealthier white women. So studies started showing in the 80s that arresting employed, i.e. wealthier white men, did have a modest effect on reducing their chances of repeating domestic violence. Whereas in a big study of Milwaukee, they found that it could up to double poor Black men's chances of committing violence, because they were operating in a very, very different kind of environment, and the stressors and the things that were going on were very different. And I just recall in 1992, this one feminist argument was, well, that just simply means that Black men are used to getting arrested, so we need even more punishment, right? And so that was the kind of thing that was going on. And now I think, kind of like Professor Chacón does, there's this move towards trying to, at least as best you can, find out what those survivors are saying. Many facets of what they believe they need now, would have needed before the violence, and then looking at populations who are most vulnerable to violence, incarcerated populations, women engaged in unregulated sex work that is highly dangerous, and they're living on the edge of economic precarity all the time. Like, I really think, survived and punished, which I know that you all have like such a great connection to, is totally right. What can you do about sexual violence in jails? You could get women out of jail. And stop putting them in jail. What could you do about women who are in relationships of violence? Well, you can figure out what's contributing to the violence, and stop it, and see if what they also want is separation, because some would and some might not. So I think there's much we can do by shifting the frame to, look at what vulnerable survivors say. And I have to say, there's a little top-downness in what I do. I'm standing outside of it as somebody who's always been a lawyer in the space, and not, and I have experiences with sexual violence myself that are informative of how I believe. But I think it's really important to try to cleanse away so many of the stereotypes and narratives of what people want and who the ideal victim is when crafting this policy, because we've seen it before. We've seen ideal victimhood narratives, and they've been extremely racist. And today we all think about, the ubiquitous creepy sex predator, but that used to be the super predator, right? Like that had a lot of purchase, victims of super predators. So yeah, I would say that's a really good observation, that, even myself, we all have to be really careful about the frames that we just assume to be true. And I think it's shifting in a good way.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being here and for talking about these issues with us, and in a space where you can't see the audience.
I know.
It can be super hard to do that. So I want to thank you for that, and for the work that you put into the book and the stories that you tell in the book, which are really, really powerful. So for those who haven't read it, I would recommend it. And let's all, we're all giving you a virtual, I'm sure, round of applause. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I have a website. It's just like ayagruber.com, and it has excerpts of each chapter. So if you wanted to check those out too, you can do it. But thank you so much for coming. I mean, I really appreciate the discussion. I wish I see some people's names I recognize in the chat, but I wish I could see all your faces. And yeah, thank you so much, Professor Chacón. This has been amazing.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.